Welcome to Ask GMBN Tech, where you get to ask us questions using the hashtag Ask GMBN Tech on, well, any of the off-road channels where, yeah, we'll see it on the comments and we can answer it. I believe you've got our first sort of question to get stuck into, to get worked up on.
Yeah, Chris has asked me, how do you set sag when you are carrying 2 to 3 litres of water? As you drink, your weight will change, therefore your sag will as well. It seems like you're always chasing your tail. Yeah, I get what he's saying here. I mean, first off, you know, congratulations for actually thinking about the water that you're carrying and the equipment that you're carrying, because a lot of people set up sag and they don't think about that. So if you imagine you're adding 3 litres of water to your back in a 3-litre bladder, for example, that is 3 kilos of weight. Now, first off, if you're setting off with 3 litres of water and that extra 3 kilos and you have accommodated that in your sag, if you're drinking it, well, it's kind of moving from bladder to bladder, isn't it? It's just displacing, it's not disappearing. However, you know, you are going to go to the toilet at some stage, you are going to sweat as well. And in hot temperatures, you could lose up to, well, maybe like a litre of water per hour. In some cases, depending on, you know, how much you sweat, what sort of effort you're putting in, loads of things come into play. And basically, you can do your best to set up at the start and make sure your bike is good for you for most of the bike ride. But, you know, things will change. Environmental changes affect your suspension, and losing water will change your suspension. I think just starting with a good starting point is probably the best thing you can do.
Really serious question here, so we've just got to be really kind of like honest and frank about this. This is from Champy on PC. Can a dropper post pneumatic chamber explode upon a greater impact? Yeah, no, it's a really in-depth one. He's apparently seen a video where someone dropped a cheap office chair and the cartridge exploded. Can this happen to dropper posts? I mean, technically, yes, this could happen, hypothetically speaking. So in actual use, I don't think so. So we'll dive in a little bit more. So yeah, in theory, we've got, you know, something that is sort of a bit like a kind of explosion, it's a bit like a small bomb, and we're pressurizing it. We've got fluids under pressure, and those fluids could kind of like leak out in a kind of like atomized way. So if there was a spark, if there's an ignition source, we could have an explosion. But only hypothetically. I mean, even if we'd got the kind of like dropper post open and then we put on a huge amount of force and dropped it really, really, really quickly, I think nothing's going to happen, unfortunately. I mean, there is, in theory, like we could have an explosion in terms of the shims, the fluid. It could slow it down enough that it just flash explodes, but I just don't think we get those forces on a bike. But realistically, it will just pop, and it will probably be just sort of like a bit of a dull pop sound, not an explosion. Not so much, you know,
no, I know. Die hard.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's where the question was coming from. I think the other factor is also, I kind of did some research into kind of like sort of diggers and stuff like that, where they're using hydraulic things to move heavy loads. They've got loads of fluid, so even though the fluids aren't necessarily flammable, and in some applications you have to have like special hydraulic fluid that isn't flammable, we've got so little amount of fluid that even if our stuff in a dropper post was flammable, I just don't think we're going to get an explosion. So we haven't thrown a dropper post out of a 7th floor window to see if it will explode or see if the cartridge will explode, because I don't think we need to, because I don't think it's going to happen. But let us know in the comments if you really think we should throw a dropper post cartridge out of a window to see if it would explode. Look, if there's enough demand, we can try and chat and try and arrange something, but effectively, I don't think it's a problem.
Rob Hill has basically asked us a bit of a troubleshooting T-type transmission question. Effectively, he's saying that he's noticed it was getting stuck in the 3rd gear. He's tried a few things. It was hitting his cassette. He's tried taking a few links out. He's tried micro adjustments. He's tried a few things, and it's not really working. So what's happening? There's a lot of questions in here. I'll put it up on the screen, the main question. But there's a lot of possibilities, obviously, which comes with troubleshooting. One thing to know is that T-type is basically set up by getting the chain length correct for your bike. That's the first port of call. And then also there's a bit of there's an A and B, isn't there, that you need to choose that's correct for your length and your bike, but also you need to get that chain tension right, which effectively is not so much, it's like setting up the sort of the B tension on your old derailleur, but instead what you're now doing is loosening off the derailleur itself and kind of pulling it taut and then getting it tightened back up. And I found when I was doing that, it wasn't perfect the first time, and it can be a bit fiddly, not quite sure whether you've got the right tension on it or not. But I think basically you need to make sure that you've got the right chain length is troubleshoot number one. Make sure you go onto the SRAM website and work out how many links you need for your chain length. That's number one, in my opinion.
Yeah.
You've said you've removed some links, and that makes me worry a little bit because it will start, you know, messing up your gears.
Yeah.
What would you say would be the next go-to on there?
Yeah, I think as you said, it's got to be just systematic. And with T-Type, I think if you know a little bit about RMX, it's quite easy to get into a pickle with it, because there's loads of stuff where the logic, you kind of like, you try and carry it over. And I've done it, I've been in the workshop and I've gone, oh, well, I need to do this. And then I've gone, oh, I can't adjust that. But the SRAM setup guide, they've got it on the app, they've got it on the website. It's really good, and it's really step by step, but it's slightly counterintuitive if you're just used to mechanical stuff.
Yeah,
so,
I agree with you.
Yeah, you're right. Chain length is key. And then also, it's really easy to kind of, as you mentioned about the kind of the rear tension, you've got to release what is the sort of equivalent of a UDH, undo that, pull the cage back, but you've also got to tighten it up at the same time. So you almost need, yeah, sometimes an extra pair of hands.
Yeah, I think going through the process is, yeah, great advice. Go from the start as if it were brand new and start again. And if you're still getting that derailleur hitting the cassette, it's definitely a tension thing. You have to literally undo it and pull it away from the cassette effectively and set it almost manually and then screw it up. So that would be our advice.
Question here from Krr 55. He's bought a new to him XC bike. It's from 2013. It's got super narrow internal rim width of 18mm. And wants to run kind of wider than 2.2 tyres. And he's asking, should he upgrade the wheel set? Well, I guess the first thing is that, no, you can run the older ones. Is it optimised? No. Will it be perfect? No. So we're talking about inner rim width, and effectively we had the narrow rim width standard for a long time because we had narrower tyres. Tyres have grown, rims have grown, and the tyres are now designed for wider profiles of rims. And that means that if you're running a really kind of fat tyre on a narrow rim, it means it can be unstable. So if you're trying to set it up tubeless, it might be trickier. If you're trying to run at really low pressures, it's not going to be that stable. Can you run it? Of course you can. You can ride it for a while, as long as you want, really. Should you upgrade it in the future? Well, I think, yeah, upgrading wheels, if they fit, if it's all boost and it's the right wheel size, upgrading tyres and wheels is like one of the best upgrades because it's your contact patch. And lighter wheels, okay, there's lots of science behind the kind of inertia of it might not make that much difference, but you can feel the difference. And I think it's worth it. So, yeah.
Yeah, because if you had on extreme, if you had a narrow rim and you had a wide tyre, it could just sort of roll around a little bit and feel unstable, but it might not. And maybe some sort of sidewall support might help that anyway. Yeah,
yeah, definitely. So, I mean, officially some brands are going to want you to run a wider inner rim, but you don't have to. You can run what you've got at the moment. As a future upgrade, yeah, it's a sensible choice to go to a wider inner rim profile so you can go for wider tyres.
My question from Nick Zetto, who says, what causes suspension air forks to rebound with a binding? Pressure is okay, it's lubricated from the outside, but on rebound it is sticking or binding. Rebound's very noisy. Okay, I'm trying to decipher what you mean by sticky and by rebound as well, because there's a couple of things that come to mind. If you are isolating rebound, as in it's not sticky going down, but it is coming up, is it that you mean that it's sort of acting slowly? Is it acting real slow? I wonder if you've played with your rebound, you may have slowed it down and possibly speeding up the rebound might help. So adding less rebound damping gives you less sort of damping on that return, so it will speed it up. That might be something to try. You've said lubricated from the outside, so I'm going to presume you've not been maintaining it from the inside. So if it's sticky in that it feels a little noisy and notchy and it's kind of going both ways, maybe you just notice it more on the rebound, it's possible that your forks need a service. So there's a couple of things here. You can do lower leg services. So you've talked about lubricating it from the outside. It definitely needs lubricating on the inside too. A lot of forks, well, most forks will have oil running around in the kind of the lower legs, and that will need replacing. It gets contaminated. Sometimes water can go down through the seals and dirt can come down through the seals, and that will make it quite dry and sticky. Or you may have even lost some oil. So you definitely need a lower leg service if you haven't done one in the last, say, 6 months. And possibly might need to go and get the dampers serviced at some stage if you've had them for more than a year. But aside from that, he's talked about bushings and binding. It's hard to decipher whether bushings are actually binding or whatnot, because there's a lot of other things that can cause a fork to not be running smoothly before you start thinking about bushings. Anyway, what's your thoughts on this?
I think it's really easy to go, oh, you know, these might be new forks and they're binding, but I think, again, there's so many small parts in a suspension fork that if the fork worked incredibly well and these bushings were perfectly sort of sized to work smoothly, well, yeah, they might not very quickly be the right size. So these bushings are a wear item and they can wear out. So maybe these forks are bedding in, but I feel like from what you've described, it's, as you've said, lower leg service time, which lots of forks you can do it with. And yeah, get the exploded diagram, get them serviced. It will help them work better and last longer. Fun question here. This is from Tea and Fruit. Good name. If you use clear or printed tape, do you have to use 2 layers? Or if you use thicker tape, do you have to use 1 layer? This is a fun question. This is about tubeless tape. As the kind of like the ever pragmatic mechanic, I'll say at least 2 full laps is better. That's best practice.
Even with thick tape? Even
with thick tape. It's more nuanced than that, because it's not ever about, oh, with this rim, it's X number of laps of tape, because there's a lot going on. You might think, oh, all I'm doing is sealing the rim, but there's a little bit more to it. I guess the very minimum that you need is never 1 lap anyway. You need kind of 1.5. You need 1.5 because you need to overlap your tape where the valve hole is, because you're going to cut a hole in that, or you're going to burn a hole in, but you want to have 2 layers on that section. I guess the other side is that from experience from me in terms of like mechanicking and riding, and seeing other riders on products that's not been necessarily set up correctly, is that, yeah, you could just put 1 lap or 1.5 laps of tape and think, oh, that's fine, that's going to be perfect. But there's so much variation in rim bed depth. So if you think of the rim profile, it's sinking down in here, and where we've got the bead is going to be in the same place because or very nearly the same place, because we're putting the right size tyres on the right size rims. But there's this huge variation between where the bottom of the rim bed is and where the tyre bead is going to sit when it's aired up. And I guess there's 2 reasons of playing around with numbers of laps of tape thickness. One is so you can pump your tubeless setup really easy, and you can just use a floor pump. So you don't have to use a compressor. And there's a reason why you might not want to use a compressor, and that's if you get a catastrophic flat on the trail, you're probably not going to have a compressor with you. So if your tubeless setup relies on the fact that you need to pop it into place, on the trail if you get a flat, it's probably not ideal. The other problem with running a setup where you need to kind of use a lot of air pressure to pop the bead into place, it probably means that the gap between where this sort of bead shelf is and where the tyre bead sits is not super duper tight. And what that means is when you're running really low pressures, if you're side loading the tyre, it can burp and it can lose air. And that's not a winner, because you don't want to lose air, full stop. The other problem with having a setup that's quite loose like this is if you, for some reason, you run over a rock and you have a catastrophic flat where you rapidly lose air and no sealant is going to fix it, well, if your tyre setup is quite loose, well, you could lose your tyre off your rim. And that's one of these things where it's kind of amusing for a little bit, because you're like, oh wow, my tyre's kind of come off the rim, that's gnarly. The next thing that often happens is it gets tangled and you stop amazingly quickly. So minimum is 1.5, but realistically it might be up to 2.5 or 3. We've done a video on how to set it up as a dry setup, setting up tubeless. You might be like, why are you doing it dry? That's just an extra step. And it is an extra step, but once you've worked out what your rim and what your tyre combo needs to get set up, you can do it with sealant in, and it's great. But that first time when you're trying to set it up and you don't know how many laps of tape to put on, if you do it dry and you need to add more tape, you can. If you've already put the tubeless sealant in there, it gets really messy and the tape doesn't really get sticky when it's covered in tyre sealant. So yeah, hope that helps. But yeah, be sensible, go on the side of caution and probably add a bit more tape.
Well, thank you for watching. And if you have any burning questions right now, then head into the comments and use hashtag Ask GMBN Tech, and we'll try and pick up that question and answer it on another show like this. But for now, thanks for watching.